Okay.
So just real quick overview. There's going to be a lot of different code blocks that you have available to you, but for our purposes in storytelling, we don't. There's only a couple of them that we think are really important that you guys should know. So first thing to notice is that they're all in categories, right? So there's a motion category, look, sound, events, control.
Mm.
There's a couple of other categories: sensing, operators, variables, and my blocks. For our purposes, we're only going to focus on those first five types of code of code blocks. The ones at the bottom are a little bit more advanced, and they're more so for if you're making something that's going to be interactive, like a game, because you can make games and stuff with Scratch as well, not just stories. But for us, again, we're going to focus on the top five, and then within each one of those sections, they're going to be codes that you don't necessarily need either. So, for example, in the excuse me, in the motions section of the code, go ahead and say that.
I want to save this.
Okay.
I'm
In that
gonna.
in the motions section of the code, the first seven code options are probably going to be the most important when you're starting to code out your story. That very first block says move, move 10 steps. This gives your character the option of moving a certain amount of steps that you tell it. So right now it's set to 10 by default, but if Mr. Thomas goes in there and he changes that number to 30, then the character will move in a straight line 30 steps and then stop. If you want your character to turn left or right, or sorry, turn in a circle, you can use either one of those turn code blocks, and then the number. Back up in motion.
Oh no, I'm just gonna
Oh, sorry.
set this so that they'll be able to see
Okay, good. So
the
we're gonna
motion
demo it now.
itself.
So click that, um, and it's moved. The 30 steps is probably talking about pixels. So 30 isn't really that big when you're talking about pixels.
Right.
If you wanted to see a more like more distance being covered, you'd have to pump that number up a bit. There we go. For turning, that number is being measured in degrees. So this is going to make the character rotate however many degrees that you have set there. Remember, a full circle is 360 degrees. So if I turn 90 degrees, it's a quarter turn. Yes, quarter turn. 180 degrees, it's going to rotate it. We're going to turn it all the way in the opposite direction. All right. So and this isn't like a flip. This is actually turning the character. And then you get to choose whether you want to turn clockwise or counterclockwise. That's why there's two different turn options. So that the first one we looked at was a clockwise turn. This one's a counterclockwise turn. All right. The next option is go to, and then you see it's set to random position, but there's also a drop down menu. Anytime you see a little triangle beside one of the options in these tabs, that means if you click on it, there'll be other options for you to choose from. So, for example, if we choose instead of random position, mouse pointer, go ahead and choose that. What'll happen is when we click on that flag to get this started, if wherever the mouse pointer is, the character will jump to where the mouse pointer is. You might, if we put a weight in there, then it'll give you time to move your mouse. But you see us jumping up towards where his mouse is because he's clicking it. Right? So that's another option for movement. Then we have the another go-to option called go to. Then it has X and Y. Mr. Thomas talked about this last week. If you remember from maybe from math, where you're drawing a diagram or drawing a line graph, and you have an x-axis and a y-axis. X-axis being horizontal, and y-axis is vertical, up and down. If you go to X and Y, if you look at those X and Y coordinates, it's almost like making a map. So when I say go to here X and here Y, I'm telling it to go to a specific place in that screen. And you can do that with numbers. So right now, you see Mr. Thomas is moving the cat around. And as he moves the cat around, the numbers here, the X and the Y values, those change. Go ahead and move it. So right now is at X is at negative 184 and the Y is at negative 96. But if he drags that cat up near the top corner of the screen, notice those numbers changed, negative 183 and positive 87. So what you can do is you can move your character to where you want it to end up. So let's say we want it to seem like it's walking across the screen. So to go ahead and drag the cat all the way to the right edge of the screen. And we find out what the coordinates are. The coordinates for the right edge of the screen are 204 on the X and negative 75 on the Y. If we type those into the go-to,
Okay, so so this actually leads us to um the next place or next motion control.
Okay, so you want to use that one.
So yeah.
Okay.
So you can actually combine, you can add this, and this is called glide. So when I click on the flag is kind of a starting button. It'll start me back to that negative 136 x-axis, and on the y it'll be negative 75. But what I can do once it plays, it'll glide me over to this position, this new position. So it's now we're creating movement for our character. So let me do that. See, and what's cool about this, you can also change this. That's what the SECS is, seconds. So you can glide, and I can change this to, let's say, 10 seconds, right? So when I hit play, now my character is moving from that first position and it's gliding to that final position. So sometimes you may have to have like a little, have a pencil or paper next to you, just so you kind of remember your coordinates. I do that when I'm laying out, a scene or something, or trying to remember where my character was at first, and then where I want the character to go. And then, like I said, this on the glide feature, that amount of time. So I had it on 10 seconds. If I change it to 3, the lower the number, the faster it'll go. All right, so then I put it on 30, and he's going to move really, really slow. That. All right.
All right. Let's look at the next group of command blocks, the looks commands. Well, actually, let's jump down to controls since you already showed us one of the main controls, and just visually some events. I'm gonna say events.
Events. Okay.
One thing you might notice about the events um, code blocks versus some of the other ones is this top edge right here. Notice how there is a kind of a rounded top on the events tab. And there's no place for you to snap anything in there. The reason that these codes are designed like that is to let you know that this is a starting point. These all of your event codes are, for the most part, they're triggers. There's something that's going to actually make the rest of your code start to run. That's why they're the beginning. That's why there's no place to snap something on top of it. They're always going to be on the top of the stack for your code block. So that's just kind of like a little visual indicator for you to let you know that if I'm going to start a new line of code, it's probably going to start with an event. We've been using the when flag is clicked event for the most part. So that's why Mr. Thomas, when he gets ready to run his code, he goes to this green flag. Green means go. Red stop sign means stop the code. But there's other ways to kick off your code as well. So, for example, this next line where it says when, and then it says space, key is pressed. Remember what I said about codes that have a little triangle beside them. That triangle is a drop down menu. So if, for right now, it's set to win space, and by space they mean the space bar, that long bar in the middle of your computer's keyboard. If you press that, then it makes something happen. So, for example, this is our glide code. Before it kicked off when Mr. Thomas clicked on the green flag. Now, since we changed the trigger, it'll tap it anytime he hits the space bar on his computer. So if he taps the space bar, see his mouse isn't anywhere near that green flag. But if he hits the space bar, that should start moving.
All right. Get a little bit of lag here, but
Yeah,
I made him go fly up.
right. So he hit
Yeah.
the space bar and the cat went up in the air. So different trigger. But again, that is a drop down menu. So it doesn't have to be the space bar. If he clicks the drop down menu where it says space,
Oh, let me change my coordinates here.
all right,
All right.
and then hit that drop down menu. Notice that there's a lot of other keyboard options he can use to control the character. He can press the up arrow or press any key or press the letter A. So there's a ton of options to choose from. But all of these are related to pressing something on the keyboard to make something happen.
Mhm.
All right.
Yep. So
Go ahead.
the more I was going to say, if you notice, like they say up arrow, the arrow keys, and some of the, of course the letter keys and everything. That's that's going more advanced. That's when people, you've probably seen a couple projects on the Scratch website where people have made games and things. Now you're dealing with like actual coding for your direction of character. When
Right.
if you're designing a game, of course, up arrow, you might make a character jump, or your left or right, of course, is to move horizontally within the space.
Hmm.
And the down arrow might be to duck from a fireball or something like that, if you're playing like Super Mario or something.
Right.
But yeah.
Right.
All right.
Back to events. Still got a couple more. Next, we have when this sprite is clicked. So this is another interesting one. You can trigger events when somebody clicks on a certain character or sprite in your story. So again, this is the same movement, but now you have to click on the cat in order to make him move.
Yep,
The
so
next, go ahead.
yep, so whenever I click on him, he'll move back to that starting point and then glide back to that finishing point.
Right.
Okay.
Next, we have when backdrop switches. So the when backdrop switches is a trigger that is tied to the change in the scenes. So far we've only talked about we've only been working on single scene projects. Shaquan brought up an interesting question a few minutes ago. He asked, okay, how do you change scenes? There's a certain tag under the look tag, I believe. Um,
Hmm.
we're going to look at that more specifically. But in addition to having the scene change, because you can have multiple backdrops in your story, you saw that in our sample story. But in addition to having that scene change, you can also use the backdrop change to make other things happen at the same time. Maybe when my backdrop changes, I make certain characters or sprites disappear from the screen. Or maybe when the backdrop changes, I make my sprites uh, costume change, or I make my sprite bigger or smaller. So you can actually even use the changing of a scene as a trigger to make other things happen. All right, let's look at, I think it's one or two more events
Okay.
to look at. Uh, Actually, no,
So
that's
if it's no, it was
for our
was
purposes, yeah,
focused on just on the first
the
four.
first four, yeah.
Uh-huh.
All right, next, let's take a look at um, the looks section.
Okay.
And here's where, in the first two options, this is where we get some kind of speech from our characters. So Mr. Thomas mentioned already that you can add narration. And in our sample story, you saw that Mr. Thomas actually narrated the story and he even made some of the character voices. But in other instances, we had the character have a speech bubble, like you would see in like a comic book. In order to create that speech bubble, you'll use the say that very first say tag. Both of them do something similar, right? So both of them say hello, but you notice that one of them has a timer on it. That timer comes in handy if you want the speech bubble to stay on the screen for a while and then go away after a certain amount of time. Because otherwise, if I was just to use the regular say tag, the one that just says say hello, it would the speech bubble would pop up, say hello, and then it would go away really quick. After it says what it needed to say, it would go away. So if I wanted to stay there for a little while, it's better to use the one with the timer. Oh no, sorry, that one stays there indefinitely.
Mm-hmm.
If I
Yeah,
wanted to
that one
go away
stays.
though, then I need to use the one with the timer versus that. He never he never said hello though. Oh, now he said it. All right. Take the go to and put the say in between the go to.
Yeah, there we
There you go.
go.
Now click it. So now he should
And then,
move back. He should move back to the start position.
uh-huh. Oh, and another thing. Oh, you said how can you change the word in the speech bubble? Yes, you can. So you're basically the same way that I changed the different location points and the timing and all of that stuff. Same way, just a simple mouse click and you can type in, you know, uh, whatever.
All right. Cool. So those are the two say options. The think options work similarly, except instead of having the little speech bubble tail on it, it has the little three dots to make it look like a thought bubble.
Mhm.
Again, that's something straight out of comic books. It's just a different way of animating what the character is doing to let you know that they're not actually saying it; they're just thinking it in their head. See, so dot dot, and then the thought bubble. Next, this one's pretty cool. The switch costume to. Again, notice that you see that drop down menu in switch where it says switch costume to, and then there's a drop down menu. That means that we get to choose which costume we're going to switch to. Remember that if you have a character that has animation, the way that animation is created is by having multiple costumes for the character. And a costume is basically just different positions for the character. So, for example, let's see if the Scratch Cat has any costumes. Yeah. So we see that he has two costumes. One costume with his foot forward, and another costume with his foot kind of bent. And that's probably to show some type of walking animation. So if we were to go in the code and say, okay, switch costume to, what'll happen is his leg will turn to that bent position once the trigger is kicked off. All right. Next, uh, there's a tag next costume. This one comes in handy if the character has multiple costumes, depending on how detailed the animation is for the character. You might see characters with 4 or 5 different costumes, basically 4 or 5 different positions that they're in when they're moving. Again, from our story, uh, we had characters that had 4 or 5 different costumes to show that they were dancing around, right? So the next costume basically lets the costume change whatever the next costume in the line is. You don't have to specifically say costume number 3 or costume number 4. It'll just go up to whatever the next costume is. See? So Then we didn't have to specify costume 2. It just said, okay, he's on costume 1. The next costume 2, change. Then what's the next costume after costume 2? Well, there's only 2 of them. Go back to costume 1. It kind of creates a loop that that happens every time you click on the trigger. Now, to Shaquan's question, switch backdrop 2. The same way you can use that switch and next option to change the way the sprite looks, you can do the same thing for your backdrop. So let's go ahead and grab that. So right now, based on this code, when you click the flag, it's going to switch backdrop to whatever backdrop we pick out of that list. Right now, set the backdrop 1 because there's only one backdrop in our scene. But if we add 2 or 3 or 4 more backdrops to our scene, then that drop-down list will give us some extra options. See, now that Mr. Thomas put the Arctic as a scene, we can switch that. And then now it's switched back to backdrop 1. Similar to the next costume, we have an option here that says next backdrop. So if we have multiple backdrops in our scene, it'll just automatically, if we use that next backdrop tag, it'll automatically go to the very next backdrop in our list. And if you want to see the list of backdrops that you have available currently in your project, you just go click on where it says backdrop over by the stage. So click on the stage. And then notice that middle tab changed from costume to backdrop. Hit there, and now I can see the backdrops down here on the left side of the screen. So my first backdrop is just a plain white screen. My second backdrop is the Arctic. So those are the backdrops that it's going to switch back and forth in between. And as I add more backdrops, that list will grow. All right, let's hop back over to the code. And back into looks. See if there's any more looks tags that we want to look at. No, I think that's it for the looks. So lastly, let's look at the sound tag. So this is kind of a review from last week. We talked about the fact that just like the sprites and the backdrops, Scratch has a ton of sounds already in the program. So if you want a meowing cat, they already have a recording of that. So we can just use the sound the sound file that's already in the Scratch program. So here's our cat meow.
Take my set up.
Right? But in addition to using the already imported sounds, the already available sounds in the program, we can also record our own sounds. And then we can use these tags to dictate how it's going to play. So this first one says play sound, meow until done. It'll play the entire sound file from beginning to end. For a sound as short as that, it didn't really make a difference. But imagine you had a song that you wanted to run throughout your story. If that song was 3 minutes long, if I use the play sound until done, it'll play the entire 3 minutes of that song. And then the next one, start sound meow, that will just kick it off. That'll just kick off whatever sound we choose. The next one, stop all sounds. If I have multiple sounds playing at the same time, and I want to stop them all at once, I can use that stop all sounds. You see there's some other options here. These are a little bit more advanced. For our purposes, the first 3 should be enough to get you to help you build a narrated story and add some sound effects to the story.